The rain was falling hard that December evening when Ronaldo first noticed him, a figure hunched under a thin military jacket outside the entrance to the upscale gym where Ronaldo trained late at night to avoid the crowds. The man's weathered hands holding a cardboard sign that read "Veteran, anything helps, God bless," in careful block letters that spoke of pride struggling against desperation. Most people walked past without a glance, their expensive workout gear and designer water bottles creating an invisible barrier between their world and his. But something about the way the man sat with perfect military posture despite his circumstances made Ronaldo slow his steps and actually read the words written in black marker on cardboard that was already beginning to dissolve in the Manchester rain. The man's name was Thomas Mitchell. Though nobody had called him by his first name in so long, he sometimes forgot he had one beyond Sergeant or Sir or the various cruel nicknames that homeless people acquire when society decides they're no longer worth basic human courtesy. And he had been living on these streets for 8 months since his benefits were cut off due to bureaucratic complications that seemed designed to exhaust veterans into giving up rather than fighting for what they'd earned. Thomas had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, had saved the lives of men who now lived comfortable suburban lives with wives and children, and jobs that paid enough to afford the kind of gym membership that cost more per month than Thomas saw in donations over several weeks of sitting on cold concrete with a piece of cardboard and a plastic cup that people avoided looking at as if poverty might be contagious. He wasn't asking for much, just enough for a hot meal and maybe a night in a hostel where he could shower and sleep without worrying about someone stealing his few possessions or the police moving him along because his presence made paying customers uncomfortable. But even these modest hopes seemed increasingly impossible as winter tightened its grip on the city, and people hurried past with their faces buried in phones and their minds focused on problems that seemed insignificant compared to his basic struggle for survival. Ronaldo had walked past him several times over the past few weeks, each time feeling a pang of something that might have been guilt or recognition, or simply the discomfort that comes from seeing human suffering and knowing you have the power to alleviate it, but haven't yet figured out how to do so without making it worse or turning charity into another form of humiliation. Tonight was different, though, perhaps because the rain was falling harder than usual, or because Thomas looked particularly defeated as he tried to shield his sign from the water that was washing away his carefully written words. Or perhaps because Ronaldo had just finished a training session where his biggest worry was whether his free kick technique was improving fast enough for the upcoming match against City. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the man who had learned to be wary of people who paid attention to him, since attention usually meant trouble. And when Thomas looked up with eyes that held too much wariness for someone who should have been relaxing into civilian life, Ronaldo saw something that reminded him of his own father's eyes during the hardest times when work was scarce and pride was the only thing standing between their family and despair. "Evening," Ronaldo said simply, crouching down so he wasn't towering over the seated man, a gesture that Thomas recognized as military courtesy from someone who understood that dignity mattered even when everything else had been stripped away. And Thomas straightened unconsciously, some buried instinct making him sit at attention, even though he was no longer in uniform and hadn't been called to attention by a superior officer in more years than he cared to count. "Evening, sir," Thomas replied automatically, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who spent most of his time talking to himself or not talking at all. And Ronaldo noticed the precision of his posture, the way his few belongings were arranged in neat rows beside him, the military discipline that had survived homelessness and bureaucratic abandonment, and the slow erosion of hope that came from being invisible in a city full of people who had learned not to see. "Cold night to be out here," Ronaldo observed, and Thomas nodded with the kind of resigned acceptance that came from having no choice about where to spend cold nights, his breath visible in the December air as he shifted to make room on the ledge where he'd established his temporary post. A gesture of hospitality, even in circumstances where he had nothing to offer but the space beside him on cold stone. They sat in silence for a moment, two men from completely different worlds, brought together by chance and rain, and the kind of recognition that happens when someone who has known struggle encounters someone currently drowning in it. And Thomas found himself relaxing slightly in the presence of this stranger, who didn't seem to want anything from him, or seem afraid that poverty might be catching. "You were military," Ronaldo said. Not a question, but a statement, based on the bearing that no amount of hardship could completely erase. And Thomas nodded, a shadow of his former pride flickering across his weathered features, as he remembered a time when that fact commanded respect, rather than pity or suspicion about what had gone wrong in his transition to civilian life. "3 tours, Afghanistan," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of memories that he'd learned not to share with civilians who thanked him for his service while crossing the street to avoid actually dealing with the consequences of that service. "Good men died over there, better men than me, and somehow I'm the one who made it home." Though home had turned out to be a concept more than a place for someone whose family had given up on him and whose government had lost his paperwork in the shuffle of bureaucratic indifference. Ronaldo listened without offering the usual platitudes about heroes and service that Thomas had learned to distrust from people who drove past veteran homeless camps without slowing down, instead asking practical questions about how long Thomas had been on the streets and what had led him there. Questions that showed genuine interest rather than the morbid curiosity that some people displayed when they encountered someone whose fall from grace made them feel better about their own precarious positions in life. The story that emerged was depressingly familiar to anyone who paid attention to veteran affairs, a combination of untreated PTSD, bureaucratic delays in benefits processing, medical bills from injuries sustained in service, and the kind of administrative errors that somehow always seem to disadvantage the people least equipped to fight them through proper legal channels that required addresses and phone numbers, and the kind of stability that Thomas had lost along with everything else. "I had a business plan once," Thomas said with the kind of bitter laugh that comes from dreams deferred too long. "Always wanted to start a small construction company. Did demolition and rebuilding over there. Good with my hands, know how to manage crews, but banks don't loan money to homeless veterans with bad credit and no collateral. Funny how that works." And there was no self-pity in his voice, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of systemic barriers that seemed designed to keep people down once they'd fallen far enough. Ronaldo found himself thinking about his own journey, from poverty to wealth, the lucky breaks and supportive people who had believed in his potential when he was just another kid from Madeira with big dreams and no guarantees, and he wondered what might have happened if he'd faced the kind of obstacles that seemed designed to crush hope rather than nurture it, if his talent had been for building rather than football, and his service had been to country rather than club. "Tell me about this business plan," he said, and Thomas looked surprised that anyone would want to hear about dreams that had been gathering dust in his mind for months, while he focused on the more immediate concerns of food and shelter, and staying warm enough to survive another night on streets that grew more dangerous as winter deepened, and desperation made people do things they wouldn't normally consider. The plan was actually quite solid. Ronaldo realized as Thomas talked with growing animation about renovation work for small businesses and residential repairs, about hiring other veterans who understood discipline and attention to detail, about creating something meaningful that would give purpose back to men who had learned to follow orders and complete missions, but found themselves adrift in a civilian world that seemed to have no use for their particular skills and experience. "How much would you need to get started?" Ronaldo asked, and Thomas laughed again, but this time with genuine humor rather than bitterness. "More than someone like me could ever get their hands on, that's for sure. Talking about tools and truck and insurance and permits, probably 50,000 just to get properly licensed and equipped. Might as well ask for 1 million. But Ronaldo was already calculating. 50,000 pounds representing less than what he spent on watches or cars, an amount that was completely life-changing for someone like Thomas, but barely noticeable in his own financial reality. The conversation continued for over an hour, two men sharing stories and perspectives while the rain gradually stopped and the late-night crowd began to thin out. Thomas finding himself talking more than he had in months, as this stranger showed genuine interest in his ideas and experiences, without the condescending tone that usually accompanied charity or the suspicious questioning that greeted anyone whose circumstances suggested failure. When Ronaldo finally stood to leave, he pressed a business card into Thomas's hand, along with enough cash for several nights in proper accommodation. But more importantly, he looked the veteran in the eye and said, "I want to hear more about this construction company. Are you free tomorrow evening?" And Thomas stared at the card in disbelief, recognizing the name printed there and wondering if homelessness had finally driven him to hallucinations. The next evening, Thomas cleaned himself up as best he could in a hostel bathroom, using the money Ronaldo had given him to rent a room and buy clothes that didn't scream homeless veteran. Though he was still nervous about meeting someone whose face appeared on billboards across the city, wondering what possible interest a football superstar could have in his small business dreams that seemed increasingly ridiculous the more he thought about them. Ronaldo arrived at the coffee shop they'd agreed on, driving a modest car rather than one of his more expensive vehicles, wearing casual clothes that helped him blend in rather than attract attention. And when he saw Thomas sitting nervously at a corner table, he was struck again by how military bearing persisted even in civilian clothes, how some qualities of character survived even the most devastating circumstances. They talked for 3 hours that second evening, Ronaldo asking detailed questions about Thomas's business plan, about the market for renovation services, about how many veterans might be interested in steady work with a company that understood their background and valued their skills. And Thomas found himself energized by the conversation, his mind working in ways it hadn't since he'd been forced to focus entirely on survival rather than planning for any kind of future. "I have a proposition," Ronaldo said finally, and Thomas braced himself for disappointment, assuming this was the point where charity would be offered, along with the kind of conditions that made it feel more like pity than partnership. But what Ronaldo proposed was something entirely different. A business investment rather than a handout, seed money for Mitchell Construction, in exchange for a silent partnership that would allow Thomas to maintain control and dignity while getting the financial backing he needed to turn his plan into reality. The legal documents were drawn up within a week, Ronaldo's lawyers ensuring that everything was structured to protect Thomas's interests, while providing the initial capital needed for tools, vehicles, licensing, insurance, and the dozens of other requirements that stood between good ideas and actual businesses. But the real work began when Thomas started reaching out to other veterans, men he'd met in shelters and support groups, men who had given up hope of finding meaningful work that utilized their skills, rather than treating them like damaged goods to be managed, rather than valuable employees to be developed. The first few months were challenging, as Thomas learned to navigate the bureaucratic requirements of running a legitimate business while building a crew of veterans who brought both exceptional skills and complex personal challenges to their work. But Ronaldo remained quietly supportive, never interfering with day-to-day operations, but always available when Thomas needed advice or encountered obstacles that required resources or connections beyond what a new small business owner could typically access. By the end of the first year, Mitchell Construction had completed dozens of projects ranging from small residential repairs to larger commercial renovations, building a reputation for quality work and reliability that came from employing people who understood mission completion and attention to detail. Veterans who approached civilian construction projects with the same dedication they had once brought to building outposts and infrastructure in hostile territory. The success stories multiplied as other veterans found stable employment and purpose through the company. Men who had been written off by society, proving that they still had valuable contributions to make when given the opportunity and support they needed to transition their military experience into civilian careers. And Thomas found himself becoming an advocate for veteran employment, as well as a successful businessman, speaking at conferences and meetings about the untapped potential in the veteran community. The reunion happened on a cold December evening, exactly 2 years after their first meeting. Ronaldo arriving at the same gym to find Thomas waiting for him, no longer homeless but wearing work clothes that bore the Mitchell Construction logo, his face showing the confidence that comes from having purpose and responsibility, and the knowledge that his efforts matter to other people who depend on him for their livelihoods. "I wanted to thank you," Thomas said, though both men understood that gratitude was insufficient to describe what had transpired between them, how a moment of human connection had transformed not just one life but dozens of lives, as the business grew and employed more veterans, creating a ripple effect of dignity and purpose that extended far beyond the initial investment. And Ronaldo shook his head, insisting that Thomas had done all the real work, had taken the risk and put in the effort, and built something meaningful from nothing more than an idea and the determination to see it through. They talked about the business's future, about plans to expand into other cities where veteran homelessness was a problem, about creating a model that could be replicated by other investors who wanted to support veteran entrepreneurship, rather than simply writing checks to charities that treated symptoms rather than addressing underlying issues of purpose and employment, and the transition challenges that so many service members faced when returning to civilian life. The evening ended with Thomas presenting Ronaldo with the first dividend check from their partnership, a small amount compared to Ronaldo's usual income, but symbolically enormous, as proof that the investment had become a genuine business rather than disguised charity, that veterans could succeed when given real opportunities rather than pity, and that sometimes the most meaningful victories happened far from football pitches, in the quiet moments when one person's faith in another person's potential transformed both of their lives. Years later, when Mitchell Construction had become a regional success story, and Thomas had been featured in magazines as an example of veteran entrepreneurship, he would still remember that first rainy night when a stranger had stopped to listen rather than simply walking past, had seen potential rather than problems, and had offered partnership rather than pity, proving that sometimes the most important assists happen off the field, when someone with resources chooses to invest in human dignity, rather than just writing checks to feel better about inequality they could actually help address through direct action and genuine relationship.